I love your voice.
This is Jenny. Yes. Her name is Balamstochens. You know the story of Balam's? Well, okay, I'm not going to tell it today because it's kind of a long story. And I got a long story already. Can we close the door?
Yeah.
If somebody comes, they come. That's the way that is. Thank you. I am Reb Kugel. How do you do? How you do? And this is my Megillah, Cuddy. And I'm going to talk to you about sacred clowning in Judaism. This is a serious subject, but it isn't only serious. So, darlings, friends, come and listen. The Talmud teaches it is greater to study than to act, because if we study, we will also act. This is a very good teaching. Okay. An anthropologist once came seeking wisdom to the little shtetl of Rubbadubdubber. He appealed to my teacher, the great Rubbadubdubber Rebbe, the great Rabbi Baruch Shem Tov, otherwise known as the Borscht.
Of course.
What, asked the anthropologist, is the role of sacred clowning in Judaism? The Borscht prayed and meditated for many hours. He also consulted a great book of wisdom, the Peki Avot, also called the Feathers of the Fathers, or the Dead Chicken Scroll. He passed this wisdom on to me when I received my 9th degree Borscht belt. You say you have the same question. What, you ask, is sacred clowning? And what is the role of sacred clowning in Judaism? Obviously with butter for dairy meals and schmaltz for meat meals. And speaking of chicken fat, we should also consider the great question that has occupied scholars for many centuries. The Holy One Baruch Hu created roads and taught us to distinguish between one side of the road and the other. On the 5th day, the Holy One created chickens. So we must ask, why did the chicken cross the road? Reb Plato says it was for the greater good. You may well have noticed that I am a clown. You didn't notice? I, Reb Kugel, discovered my deeper clown nature when I was part of a counter demonstration against American Nazis. Our teacher, Reb Arthur Waskow, says an appropriate response to contemporary Nazis, may their name be blotted out, would be to make Purim in the street, to stage an in their faces celebration of the defeat of the archetypal Jew hater Haman, as told in the biblical book of Esther. And what is the traditional way to celebrate Purim? To have a clown party. So why should this be so? Further, why does esoteric Jewish tradition describe the rowdy Purim festival, root of all Jewish clowning and theater, as fundamentally similar to Yom Kippur, the most sacred day of the year? And more generally, what is the place of sacred clowning in Judaism? And why did the chicken cross the road? The great Reb Darwin says it was the logical next step after coming down from the trees. And who am I to argue with such a smart man? The anthropologists teach us that most cultures have forms of ritual humor
in which the most sacred tenets of the group's faith are parodied, and significant parts of social control are allowed to lapse for a period of festival.
A party. This includes cross-dressing, sexual outrageousness, scoutology, parodies of sacred texts and performances, and mocking of religious authority. Sounds like fun, doesn't it? Reb Conrad Hayes says,
religious humor is part of the prophetic warning against idolatry and against that most great blasphemy of all, to claim or to possess or to be as God.
Such a serious point. He says,
laughter provides perspective, without which piety is in danger of becoming pride, devotion of becoming fanaticism, and the sacred, the demonic.
So why clowning? Clowns are individuals who act in an absurd manner because they naturally lack common sense and social propriety or intentionally pretend to do so. As Reb William Williford says,
the clown constitutes and mediates the border between sacred and profane, cosmos and chaos, good and bad, human and animal, human and saint, or even God.
Sweetheart. Some clowns, he says, are just silly, but others
share magical and religious function with priests and medicine men who have a direct responsibility for the well-being of society.
ritual clowning is part of seasonal ceremonies or rites of passage, such as weddings and initiations in many cultures. To this day, some communities even have wedding jesters or hire a stand-up comic for a bar mitzvah. Reb Wolfgang Zucker says,
the clown expresses the paradox at the heart of all social order. Whatever creates, maintains, and protects the social structure makes people feel at home, but it also deprives us of freedom. In some way, every social order claims to be from God, but this can't be absolute, because after all, God allows something to exist outside of this order.
As Reb Samuel Miller says, the human fool.
The human fool, so ridiculous and even contemptible to human eyes, is just the way any person looks when inspected by the Creator.
As for the chicken, Reb Einstein says, whether the chicken crossed the road or the road crossed the chicken depends upon your frame of reference. When I was looking for sacred clowns, wasn't it logical to look in Judaism? Why not, Booby? That's what I thought. Judaism is so serious about both God and the world. And Jewish ritual life is so structured, concentrated, even pressurized. Such a spirituality would make clowning a valuable and logical development, like a steam valve. Also, Judaism worries a lot about boundary issues as such. Inside and outside issues, what it means to be a stranger, the distinction between sacred and profane. In such a culture, the clown who walks the edge should have particular power. I started to understand the importance of boundaries in Judaism because I was thinking about Jewish clowning, both what it has been and what it could be, and why not? In fact, hasn't sacred clowning had a crucial place in Judaism for a long time? It has. The most important way Jews clown is Purim, which probably has always been a festival in which the whole community clowns. I used to have a rabbi who dressed up like Yasser Arafat. Serious guy. Purim celebrates the defeat of Haman, who planned to murder all the Jews of Persia just because Mordecai, a Jewish gatekeeper, would not bow to him. The story is a melodrama, even a bloody farce. It includes a drunken and foolish king, a beauty pageant, coincidences and miscommunications, even a false accusation of attempted rape against the villain. Better than Peyton Place even. And it's topped off when many of the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fears of the Jews had fallen upon them. Talk about wish fulfillment fantasies. So where is God in this Purim story? Nowhere. Although later editors added pious prayers, the victory of the Jews and the Esther story is a result of luck, loyalty, and the love of a foolish king for the winner of a beauty pageant. Even funnier, the survival of the Jews is made possible by the assimilated Esther intermarrying with the Persian king Ahasuerus. Pretty fun. So how do we celebrate Purim? We read the whole Megillah. That's why we say it's the whole Megillah. When your grandma tells you the long story, it's the Gatsa Megillah. The book of Esther. Every time the villain Haman's name is read, the whole congregation makes noise to drown out his name, because we are commanded to remember to forget the name of Haman, like the name of his ancestor Amalek, who preyed on the weak. And an elephant never forgets. Elephants, chickens, pretty soon I'll have a whole book. But that's another story. So, does the Purim story have historical roots? Scholars are still arguing about that. What else do scholars have to do anyway? They enjoy it. If you got 2 scholars, you got 3 opinions and 4 schools of theory. Maybe Purim was adopted by the Jews from an ancient pagan festival. So which came first, the chicken or the egg? Oh, another chicken joke. Certainly the carnival aspect of the festival is very ancient, older than my grandmother even. One bit of Purim Torah argues that science proves all food is treif, not kosher, not to be eaten, because its atoms must at some time in the past have been part of a pig. To avoid starving to death, we are permitted to eat treif food until Talmud students learn enough science to solve the problem. So let's go get a pepperoni pizza. On Purim, observant Jews are commanded to give special charity and send gifts to friends, but also get so drunk they cannot distinguish between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordecai. In Israel, there's a major street carnival called Ad Lo Yada, from the Talmudic injunction to drink until Ad Lo Yada, until you don't know. Of course, some of us don't know anyway. Of course, Purim is an angry, bloody story. Reb Elisha Ostreicher describes it as horror wrapped up in entertainment. One year, there was serious discussion in the Jewish renewal movement of changing the Megillah, or even eliminating the holiday altogether, because it celebrates the slaughter by the Jews of 75,000 Persians after Haman's death. The biblical precedent was used by supporters of Baruch Goldstein, who was not a nice boy, to justify his murder of Muslims on Purim in 1994. This is serious business. But Reb Buddha says, if you ask why the chicken crossed the road, you deny your own chicken nature. So, why does esoteric Jewish tradition teach that Purim is the only holiday that will be celebrated in the Messianic age? Rabbi Michael Strassfeld points out,
the time when all our rules and inhibitions are swept away is also when we are able to see how easy it is to change from Mordecai to Haman, from a crusader for justice to simply a crusader.
this is why the Talmud says we fully accept the Torah only on Purim, for only when we can mock the tradition can we fully accept it. Otherwise, we make the tradition into an idolatry rather than a smashing of idols.
Ad Lo Yada is not an animalistic state of stupor, but a messianic mystical moment where there is no difference between Haman and Mordecai, good and evil, for both are found in the Holy One, who created light and darkness, made peace and created evil.
Amen. Reb Arthur Waskow has written that both Purim and Yom Kippur involve the casting of lots.
To remind us that chance has an important role in the world, but it does not rule the world. There is absurdity in the world, but the world is not absurd.
From his lips to God's ear. The sages punned that Yom HaKippurim, the day of obliterating of sin, is a Yom HaPurim, a day that is like Purim. Both involve the casting of lots. So we can play craps on Yom Kippur. In the Purim story, the casting of lots saved the Jews. On Yom Kippur, a lot is cast to determine which goat will be the consecrated sacrifice and which will be the scapegoat, driven out to carry the people's sins into the wilderness. Which is which? Only her hairdresser knows for sure. But Esther and Mordecai saved the Jews of Persia from being the scapegoats in the Purim story. And history, Inquisition or pogrom,
World War II, or the latest news from the Middle East keeps it relevant. Sad, but true. Reb Jean-Paul Sartre, the nauseated, says that in order to be true to itself, the chicken found it existentially necessary to cross the road. But Reb Waldo Emerson says the chicken did not cross the road, it transcended it. So go figure. So, what about the other important clown tradition in Judaism? This is the wedding jester, the Badchen. Reb Michael Wex, who used to perform as a wedding clown in Toronto, says, it's not all fun and games. The tradition is traced back to the mitzvah of making the bride merry. But in the Jewish wedding ceremony, notes of sorrow are introduced to temper the joy. Unadulterated joy prior to the advent of Messiah is not a Jewish concept. And even if it were, any happiness at all is likely to attract the ruchs, the shadim, and the ayin hora, spirits, demons, and evil eye. The traditional Badchen had not done his job unless the bride was in tears at the end of his oration. Were the tears supposed to be laughter? From the description, serious or satirical, of the bride's duties, or moral admonition, also part of the jester's traditional role. Different sources say different things, so what else is new? One of the favorite bits of the old-time Badchen was making one side of his face laugh and smile, and the other side frowns and cries. I can't do that. It's too hard. Satires on sacred texts were common, also roasts, especially of the guests, and when describing the wedding presents. Cheap, rich people, what a great target. At traditional weddings, friends and families also performed funny bits. So why should people clown at weddings? It makes a lot of sense if clown is a mediator of boundaries, because weddings are nothing if not shatterers of boundaries between two people, between two families. The breaking of the wine glass is the least of it. All kinds of stuff gets broken, and that's if the waiter doesn't drop a tray. The tradition teaches just as the original Adam in the image of God was both male and female, the new couple now becomes an Adam, a human being in the archetypal sense of the word. Each spouse is the other's better half. And maybe the offspring of the new couple will be Messiah. Who knows? What was that other important question? Oh, yes, the chicken. Rev Ronald Reagan, Der Gipper, says he forgets why the chicken crossed the road. So, but enough with the formal clown events. I got something even better than that. Would you believe me if I tell you that the archetypal Jew actually is a sacred clown? It's true. The Jew is the everyman who argues with God about justice, who is both a universal conscience and a universal persecuted scapegoat. That's the historic horns of the Jew's dilemma. And the fate of the Jews certainly sometimes has seemed as random as the casting of lots. In what ways are Jews like clowns? Let's start at the top. Prophets and high priests have clownish characteristics, sometimes in the Bible and sometimes in folktales. The prophet Hosea is made a fool and a cuckold by God, who orders him to marry a harlot so he can see what God has to put up with. The high priest wears strange clothing and purifies with ashes. Elijah, a fanatic in the Bible, returns in disguise in folktales to reward the humble and righteous. They say when the angel of death enters a town, the dogs sniff him out and bark. But when Elijah makes his presence felt, the dogs roll on their backs and begin to play. Nice fellow. And Elijah said in the Talmud that the two jesters would go to heaven because they made people feel better. And then there's Abraham haggling with God over the number of just men in Sodom. His mirror image is Job, the greatest kvetch who ever lived. The just man demanding to know why he suffers. From one perspective, these are the actions of heroes. From another, of clowns. Shall not the judge of the earth all do right? Demands, let's try that again. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Demands Abraham.
But this is just another form of Job's question about his own suffering. And how does God answer? With a question, of course.
Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?
Job's classic answer.
Duh. Whatever you said. Oh God.
Such a question. The eternal question of the suffering of the innocent and the righteous, the prosperity of the wicked. What does it really ask? Whether the universe is morally chaotic and ruled by chance. Why else do the names of both Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, and Purim, the clown holiday, refer to the casting of lots? Emily Dickinson, the devout and scholarly maid of Amherst, who was one of the very few female recognized masters of Torah, says the chicken crossed the road because it could not stop for death. Believe me, this is relevant. Jewish humor is a subject of interest, even among mainstream scholars. Everybody's writing papers and books, even big names. So what's so interesting? One way or the other, as Reb House says,
the Jews clung to the myth of the chosen people, despite the most extreme adversity and persecution. But they were much more too realistic not to realize the grandiose anomaly between their claim and their position. So the characteristic strategy of Jewish humor was an irony which measured the distance between perception, pretension, and actuality, held it up for public inspection, and then made of it the salt of self-ridicule. The Talmud itself contains many jokes, questioning whether being chosen was so wonderful. Some great Jewish jokes actually have the structure of clown skits. For instance, there is a classic bit where a white-faced officer clown insults a shabby tramp clown who's playing a recruit in basic training. It's exactly like the following joke. A little Jewish man, it's always a little Jewish man, is walking down the street in Germany in the early 1930s when a Nazi approached him going the other way. The Nazi sneered at the Jew. Schweinehund, he shouted. The Jew took off his hat, offered his hand, and replied, Cohen, I'm pleased to meet you. The scholars say this joke mixes two kinds of social interaction, extreme hierarchy and meeting between peers. Many negotiations between God and human in the Torah and the Midrash can be read the same way, as a breaking down of hierarchy, and even maybe as humor. And speaking of hierarchy, Reb Timothy Leary says the chicken crossed the road because it's the only kind of trip the establishment will ever take. An important Jewish mystical teaching is that every person should have two pockets. Didn't your mother tell you that? Like wearing clean underwear in case you should get hit by a taxi. So on a piece of paper in one pocket is written, for me, the world was created. On a piece of paper in the other is written, I am dust and ashes. What a paradox. The ultimate impression left by Jewish humor, while not buoyant, is of a certain irrepressible integrity. Reb Suzanne Langer writes, the buffoon really is the indomitable living creature, fending for itself, tumbling and stumbling, getting into scrape after scrape and getting out again, with or without a thrashing. He is the personified élan vital, genuinely amoral, now triumphant, now worsted and rueful, but in his dismay he is funny because his energy is really unimpaired. But wait a minute, this doesn't fit. The Jew as clown is clownish because he is concerned with the moral. He insists that the universe is not morally chaotic. Tradition tells us God has two names. YHWH, the unpronounceable name based on the root to be, is traditionally spoken as Adonai, Lord. It is said to represent the merciful God, the one that can be talked into sparing the just. Elohim represents the God of whirlwinds, earthquakes, and airplanes crashing into elementary schools. History seems to support Job's experience more than Abraham's. But the religious Jew insists that justice is rewarded and wickedness punished.
How foolish. But the deeper tradition says this is humanity's job, especially the Jews' job, to fix the world, to reunite the world with its caring God. Boy, it's a big job. Perhaps the world is chaotic, but it is the job of the servants of sacred order to make it whole. The 613 mitzvot of everyday living are the way traditional Jews have been taught to do that. On the other hand, common sense and compassion are always supposed to trump strict observance. Trump, like we need a new word. And the work will not be done while we live, but we are not free to desist from it. So go figure. What was that other important question? Oh yes, the chicken. Reb Ronald Reagan, der Gipper, says he forgets why the chicken crossed the road. And he told that joke already, but he forgot. There is a story that in the concentration camps, the rabbis held a beit din, a rabbinical court. God was the defendant. God was found guilty for allowing the slaughter of his people. And after the court was adjourned, the rabbis held their usual prayer service. There is another story that the Jews in the camps chanted the traditional hymn, I believe with perfect faith that though he tarry, the Messiah will come. What is there in Jewish history to support that faith? Not much, except for one amazing clownish fact that the Jews have survived while the great civilizations of Rome, Greece, Egypt, and Persia, the empires of the Inquisition and Hitler, which overshadowed us and held us captive for a time, have passed away. So isn't it appropriate that the only holiday which will, according to the tradition, continue even after the Messiah comes, the holiday based on a story in which God is hidden and the survival of the Jews hangs on chance, is a clown party? When you ask the Sphinx why the chicken crossed the road, it says, you tell me. May the clown in all of us become a blessing in all our lives. May the clown in all of us help to touch the lives of others in a way that will lead to further blessings. Amen. Thank you for coming. I know it's long.
That's good. Hold on. Very.
Have you got questions?
I have a comment
Yes,
about joy,
yes.
because the Kabbalah tells us that the absence of joy is sickness or disease, and that joy is the cure, the
Yeah.
antidote, the prevention for being sick. So, I think that's you.
Thank you.
Bringing joy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is, I will tell you the Balaam story. Yes.
Just a comment, years ago, when I had many Hasidic weddings.
Oh, yeah.
Have any of you been to a real
No,
Hasidic wedding?
they had a balcony.
Oh, yeah, the Hasidic weddings that I attended were quite amazing. The reason I was there was I was a kid and I was working as a photographer's assistant, taking pictures of the weddings when appropriate. And after the ketubah writing ceremony, which would last hours between the rabbis with many schnapps going around, and then the appetizers, and then the ceremony and the food, and I mean that would literally be 5 or 6 hours. And then at the end, they would have what they call the mitzvah tanzer, the mitzvah dancer, which is, I guess, what you were referring to as the bodkin. And that would be a famous Jewish guy known to the community from Williamsburg or Borough Park or whichever Jewish community. And he would stand on a chair and for 2 or 3 hours lead the mitzvah tanz, to dance, where the bride would dance with all of her uncles with a handkerchief, because you're not allowed to touch, And then she would be paraded around on the chair, which is where we got the tradition in the bar mitzvahs to do the same for the bar mitzvah kid. But then the mitzvah tanzer again would stand on a chair and tell jokes at everybody's expense in the audience. I'm not going to say dirty stories, because that would definitely be treif, but stories that were like with double entendres about what the bride and groom were going to be doing for the next 48 hours nonstop. And, having never even met each other most of the time, and telling all kinds of jokes about the community and everything like that. It was pretty amazing and left an indelible memory of clownishness in my head. So if you ever get a chance to get invited to a real Hasidic wedding, definitely go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm new to the Jewish community. I converted last year.
Welcome.
Thank you. And, my husband and I talk about, celebrating Purim and like with children and whatnot, and that's a beautiful thing, but how would you recommend incorporating it in like a community base where it is for the adults? Because I do feel like it's always children based.
Adults were, dress up too. Absolutely. I mean, it's gotten to be kind of kids' party,
Yeah,
and I think that's kind of a shame.
yeah, because I heard you told me that in Israel, like, Purim is celebrated by,
Getting drunk.
right, everybody.
Everybody.
Yeah.
And the kids.
Well, I don't know about that, but I do think there is like that difference, which I always
Oh, yeah.
hear, like there's kid
Yeah.
Purim parties, but
Yeah.
the way you were so animated during this discussion, which is like, we should have more of this
Yeah.
in our lives.
Well, we could do that.
Yeah.
I think it depends where you go to. There's
Yeah.
plenty of places that have the kids' carnival
Yeah.
on the day after. And
Yeah.
because Purim also, you're supposed to hear the Megillah, supposed to hear the whole thing. And that's hard for the kids to sit through there. And
That's true.
so the noise helps.
But all of Yiddish theater comes out of the Polish
Yeah.
field,
Yeah,
and stand-up comes out of the vodka and the Burbs field.
yeah. I think you just bring bring awareness to me of how sacred humor is, and it's not something to take lightly, which,
Oh, it is something to take like.
yes. But something to incorporate,
Yes.
it is sacred in and
Yes.
of itself.
I think, even starting with the reform movement, which was in Germany,
Yeah,
it was an effort to live like regular people. So it sort of pushed down the things that were crazy and the things that were not like, although, a lot of European countries have carnival, but it's before Easter, so it's a little bit complicated.
right.
But, we want to we don't want to look too wild and crazy.
Right.
So I think that's one of the reasons it became a children's thing. It's
Yeah.
was never supposed to be a children's thing.
Hanukkah also wasn't supposed to be necessarily a children's holiday, so why?
Right.
But it was not that important until, well, it was important, because there's this halacha of Hanukkah where you're supposed to have a menorah if you travel.
Well,
So it's more important than some people think.
I also want to mention, we talked about Michael Wax.
Yes,
I've been blessed to hear him in person many times. He's very dry, but he talks about Jewish humor. And
Yeah,
how
yeah.
special Jewish humor is, the jokes. Jewish jokes are unbelievable. If you've never heard
Yeah.
him, get his
Yeah.
audio or even his books, but his audio is amazing. And there's a lot of Jewish.
well, you should know that Reb
Story.
Kugel was born, and this talk was first given at a conference at 8:00 in the morning with like 8 people, scholarly conference on fantasy and the arts. So it's a long time ago, but I updated it a little bit. The stuff about Talmud, I just really found out. Really interesting.
It's amazing how our jokes just pretty so Jewish.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Yeah,
I just wanted to say a story about the Purim I was at most recently. I go to Bard and we rewrite it and put it on just, for us, so it's typically not kid friendly. Which is great, and my friend Ethan's playing the king, and the way that they did the beauty pageant was, he'd say, all right, bring one in, and they'd hold up a sheet, and he and this person would go behind it, they'd shake the sheet around, and there'd be like a boing noise, and he'd say, next. So 1, 2, and Esther's getting ready to come through, and then our rabbi's dog went behind the sheet of his own free will. There's a pause, and Ethan goes, next, and he goes out.
Well trained dog.
I said to them after, I was like, you could make this part of the show. Just get a treat. Akka, come over.
That is inspiring to hear, though. I feel like as my husband and I become in the community, like generally the area, how wonderful would that be to just try to create that, amongst people our age and older, if there's
We
no
have a
reason.
Purim festival, but it's mostly the kids.
Right, I think we went to the one in Phoenix that night. Yeah. That sounds lovely.
Oh, they were still having lunch.
I had.
Yeah.
Just, years ago, I was a teacher, and I worked with another teacher who was not Jewish. And she came up to me one day and she said, Judaism is such a sad religion. That is because she was only familiar with Yom Kippur and the Holocaust. She really didn't know anything else. But if you take the time, especially people new to the religion, if you take the time to delve into Jewish history, there are generations of people who lived and who had good lives and who had a lot of merriment and mitzvot and simchas, which is happiness, weddings, bar mitzvahs, brises, naming ceremony, a lot of positive things. It's very hard when all this cloud is constantly over our heads. And now again with October 7th.
Yeah.
But I'm reminded of, some of the stories of Isaac Bashevis Singer include a lot of humor, a lot of clownishness. The clowns in the old towns and the old shtetls,
Yeah.
where each town had the Gimple the fool, some fool in the town who was actually the sage, and the stories of Sholem Aleichem with Tevye, and that kind of a thing. And
Yeah.
And look at the klezmer music. I mean, if you
Yeah.
hear it early this morning, hopefully there'll be the concert later. But that's so joyous. Freilach.
yeah, it just reminds me of the high price of eggs now, where people are scrambling to find cheaper
That's a
eggs.
good one.
That is a good one.
But
The
they
scrambling.
yeah. Oh, they, well, I'm coming out of my shell. They had, an egg truck was hijacked,
Oh.
but they said that the driver was a hard-boiled kind of a guy. Yeah, so, you just gotta be careful of those kind of, because there are dozens of jokes like that
Yeah.
about eggs. So,
You'll be here all week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, just keep your sunny side up.
Being happy and being joyful. Happy is more superficial, like you put your smile on your face,
Hmm.
but joy comes from some kind of deepness, like a connection
Oh, yeah.
to our soul, our people, our connection to our maker.
There is a lot one of my friends said to me, a lot of all of the music that's more Christian, that's about Christmas, is very solemn, things Silent Night, things like that. He said, all of the Hanukkah songs are party songs.
Well, one of the Christian songs really
Well, the pop songs, yeah.
Yeah, Yearning, which I just find to be.
Yes.
I'm dreaming of a white Christmas is written
Yes.
by a Jew. And so was the Easter parade.
I did not know that.
Yes.
Jews are everywhere.
By Jews.
Yeah.
And have yourself a merry little Christmas. Irving Berlin.
Oh, is it up in Berlin?
But he couldn't help it.
All right.
Thank you. You have a lot of guts.